Welcome to Practical Talk Time. I'm your host, Usha, Kumar. I have with me here today a wonderful guest, Ed Heflin from the Connecticut Green Party. And he's here to talk a little bit more about his party, their policies, their plans, and what they want to achieve for the people of Connecticut here. So please join me in welcoming Ed Heflin.
Thank you, Usha. It's great to be on with you again. Now that we're post-election of 2014, November 4, what I'd like to do is just talk a little bit about the Green Party itself and the movement that was the Green Party. The Green Party, just to give you a little historical background, was a movement that originated in Europe. I've lived in Europe personally for many, many years myself. I have family there as well, too. But it started in the 70s as sort of a grassroots. It was an environmentally conscious, anti-nuclear, social justice party. It was a party that kind of developed, as I say, grassroots, so it developed out of ordinary citizens like me, like you, or like anybody else, who said, you know, with politicians and corporations, they're just not listening to us. They're just not getting us the results we want and, more importantly, need. You know, where it concerns, for example, the economy or the environment or education. Again, very socially minded to benefit communities, to benefit the people of the communities more so than, let's say, the corporations that oftentimes have very strong lobbyists either at the state or the federal level.
Yeah, that's what we find, that although we have the two major parties in this country, they almost look alike with all the lobbying and everything else, and with the corporations, there doesn't seem to be too much difference between the middle of one party and the middle of the other party.
Usha, you've touched on a very important point, and that is a point of almost, I've heard it characterized as the Democrat, you're referring to the two-party system, Democrat versus Republican as being basically this two sides of a two-sided, one or the other side of a two-sided coin. So essentially the same sort of policies may be advertised slightly differently or marketed slightly differently, but ultimately the results or the positions being pretty much the same for most of the important issues. And I think that hit a nerve with many people, including myself, I have to admit, wherein you began to say, well, neither of those two parties addresses properly the sort of issues in the way that I want them addressed, neither in a socially conscious manner, nor in a socially justifiable manner, or in anything but that might concern itself with ultimately profits associated with a corporation or potentially with buying off a politician.
What are the other third parties that started but weren't really able to
other third parties? Well, the Tea Party, for example, the Conservative Party, the Green Party, of course, is the party that I'm presently aligned with, for a number of different reasons, by the way. The Family Party here in Connecticut, and I think there might be the Labor Party as well, too. Now, I want to point out, I've often heard it lambasted, the Green Party as being a socialist en route to communist party. I just don't buy that. As a matter of fact, if you look carefully at what I am advocating, for example, within the Green Party, specifically with public banking, this is banking actually in its most democratic form. So if you want to talk about going back to the roots of the United States of America, the right of everybody to have a vote, have that vote be counted, and have that vote count, even more importantly.
Yeah, because now policies are not based on the public request, but it's being made on companies' requests.
Absolutely correct. And that's something I touched on a little bit earlier there when I talked about lobbyists. So you can buy a lobbyist, and you can buy the ability for a lobbyist to be able to influence a politician or a group of politicians so as to sway vote and make legislation that's essentially tailor-made to the profit interests of a corporation. Not that that's bad, per se, but when those profit interests are in direct contradiction if you were to juxtapose them to what is in the best interest of the people or communities, or potentially sustainable sorts of businesses or sustainable sorts of economic practices, then there's a set of issues, a set of clashes that you really should work out. And unfortunately, you may not be able to work that out, as I came to the conclusion, with either of those two mainstream or mainline parties, the Democrat
many
and
policies.
Republican.
Yeah, many policies seem to be,
Seem to be-
exploiting the people, really.
Oh, absolutely. Unfortunately, politicians are in the pocket of many of the corporations. They're bought and paid for. Again, this is the lobbyist, which is kind of a gray area of the law, but a certain amount of lobbying is legal.
Yeah, for example, how much people's taxes paid for a lot of the companies, and even now they bail out companies, and
Well, that's absolutely correct. I think you're referring
subsidize big corporations for their huge hundreds of thousands of acres of farms.
That's a good point
I don't
as
see
well.
why we have to subsidize them.
That's a very good point. Not
I
just
read recently that even the small individual farmer doesn't get those subsidies, but these big corporations with their hundreds of thousands of acres of farms, they get them.
get subsidies in different sorts of
agricultural.
I would say different sorts of treatment. I would say unequal treatment actually under the law. So certain laws are interpreted to mean small farms under a certain either acreage or a certain production or a certain sort of a grand total dollar value. You're absolutely right about that.
Yeah, and corporations investing overseas and not bringing the money in here, and not paying taxes on those.
That is another
they're not
issue.
paid taxes, and whereas individuals are required to pay. And
right. As I understand it presently, and it depends on who you source as far as where you get your numbers for that amount. But the amounts that are considered to be repatriatable from multinational corporations that may be headquartered in the United States but have, of course, offices elsewhere, is anywhere from $2.5 trillion with a T to $5 trillion is what I've heard. I'm not sure where the number is exactly, but either of those in that range is a very big number. And of course, the U.S., the taxpayer would benefit greatly by having potentially corporations pay a larger share of their tax burden, presumably. Now, but I wanted to get back to what the Green Party was and kind of how it originated. It started, as I said before, in the 70s, in Europe actually. And Germany was very big in the Green Party. As a matter of fact, today we have elected officials in the Green Party internationally in places like Canada, in the UK, in Ireland, in Parliament that is, and in Germany. The German Green Party is has become very strong over the last half a decade or so. And of course now in the United States, the Green Party is represented in every one of the 50 states of the United States. So we do have representation in each and every one of the states at this point in time.
And if we want to know, is this going to be some overseas domination in the U.S. or is it something very indigenous? Only the concept is borrowed and
it's people, in my opinion, are people everywhere, and especially where it concerns green and this notion of social justice, sort of a grassroots idea of what democracy should be. So anywhere democracies flourish, I think ultimately you'll find a Green Party that wants to flourish under the umbrella of democracy, as opposed to, as I said before, it shouldn't be confused certainly with communism, which it is not. I mean, if you think about public banking, and I've said this before, public banking is the allocation of funding, an extension of credit, the creation of loans, the creation of jobs through creating new businesses, incubating companies, creating new businesses that benefit directly those individuals or those groups in society from which that money was accumulated, taxes, revenue, et cetera, from the state of Connecticut, if they were to go to a state bank in the state of Connecticut, would benefit directly. There would be direct accountability, traceability of where that credit was extended, what jobs it created, what businesses it sustained or fostered.
But I wonder if this might fall under the same kind of malaise, as you might call, that's there in government agencies or government-run anything.
Right.
And because here the idea is that a privately run organization is run more efficiently than a publicly run one.
Well, let me address that. My background is scientific. If there's evidence for something, it's credible evidence, and it was a controlled experiment, let's say, that was unbiased, then you should take that evidence to heart and begin to extend whatever conclusions you're going to draw from that evidence to other things. Let me point to perhaps the biggest evidence I could point to. I'll first talk nationally with respect to the United States, and then I'll talk internationally, because I know a little bit about both, with respect to public banking in this particular platform. In public banking, there is a bank, the Bank of North Dakota, which has been in existence for almost 100 years now, 96 odd years, since 1918, which is when they were originally formulated and then chartered a little bit, either that year or 1919. And they have, for example, over the last 10 years, they have returned to the citizens, to the people of North Dakota, almost $500 million. I think the number is, depending on which decade you choose to look at, I think it's from 2002 to 2012, $440 million. And it has been either break even or positive every single year of its existence, to my knowledge. So that's the evidence I look at when I say, can it work here? Can it work in any one of the United States? And the answer resoundingly is yes, and it does.
What is the size in dollar amount do you envisage this kind of a public banking in Connecticut?
For Connecticut?
Yeah.
Well, it would be a little bit bigger than, eventually, a little bit bigger than North Dakota. I think North Dakota now deals with total asset amounts in the order of $2.5 billion, maybe $3 billion. I haven't looked at their balance sheet lately. So for the state of Connecticut, I would hope that we could build out a balance sheet potentially in the range of $4 to $5 billion. Now, to be able to create that, we would talk about appropriating certain monies, which right now are either laying fallow or getting less than 1%, 0.16% are the official numbers for the stiff account, for the $4.5 billion that we have in Wall Street, wherein we're getting a return of 0.16% on average. So with State Bank of Connecticut, we would, through fractional reserve banking, get much higher return on investment. In fact, we would be able to leverage completely legally roughly 10 times whatever investment we put in. So if I'm talking about a $4 to $5 billion bank, potentially, what I'm talking about in terms of capital investment is something in the neighborhood of $400 million to $500 million. And my goodness, if we're sending Wall Street 4.5 billion with a B dollars every year, if we were to just retain a tenth of that to create a bank that essentially equates to, in size, what we send in sum total, it just makes perfect sense.
But don't we have enough private banks in Connecticut that are sitting on so much cash that can be loaned out to the people and the businesses?
This is one of the greatest misconceptions I have heard to date, and this is very analogous to what happened in Wall Street in 2008, when essentially the citizens of the United States attempted to create or attempted to, and there was actually some serious discussion about nationalizing banks at that point in the United States. I'm not suggesting that that should have been done, but what was done was almost 800, I think it was, the number at the time was the first QE1, the first so-called bailout.
The quantitative easing.
Well, that's what it became known as later on, after the financial engineers got a hold of terminology and began to use more advanced language so it wouldn't be so questioned or questionable by the people on Main Street. $780 billion, if memory serves. was the original amount. And of course, there were a number of follow-ups that ended up ballooning that total to something like 2.5 trillion ultimately of the aggregate of all that was eventually given or extended in credit. But where did that come from? That came from the taxpayers. That came from promises for future, essentially tax revenues from the taxpayers of the future.
Yeah.
Your
But that
children,
had to be done to
It had to be
stabilize
done.
the financial markets.
it was
and,
argued at the time it had
Yeah.
to be done, otherwise certain additional investment banks on Wall Street would collapse, thereby
Yeah.
cascadingly causing the economic system to completely
collapse,
melt down,
yeah.
is the way it was described at the time. And I think Hank Paulson...
and the government says that they did get the money back. So we are happy to hear most of it.
Well,
So-
yes and no.
Okay,
The
let us know
government-
about that.
Okay, there were amounts paid back by various investment banks on the street. But remember, we extended credit as people to Wall
Yeah.
Street with the understanding or the tacit or implicit belief that that money would then go from Wall Street
Back to the people.
back to extend credit to the people so that we could regrow the economy, which was the real reason. I mean, the banks were failing
Well,
as
which
a
is
result
why I
of-
was saying banks are sitting on a lot of cash, but they don't want to lend it to the people.
I don't know if
And
that's
they are
entirely
able
true.
to just lend it overnight to other banks themselves and then
Right.
just...
At this point in time, I don't know if that's entirely true. Certainly, when they received the injection of cash, the Wall Street banks, shortly after the bailouts and the quantitative easing, subsequent quantitative easing that followed, yeah, they did have quite a bit of cash
Cash,
available
okay.
for overnight. They kept them in overnight
Yeah.
accounts, basically.
Because they were
deriving-
getting more money without no risk.
With no
So
risk.
So they
And
were
that's
able
what,
to get-
unfortunately. So think about it. What did the American citizens do? Well, they they did their part to create a state, a bank, a public bank that would have benefited the public had the bankers kept their end of the bargain, so to speak,
see.
or their
Yeah.
implicit end of the bargain,
Yeah.
which was to extend credit now with the new funds that they'd had, which were used in addition to shoring up their balance sheet, which would have been used or was understood to have been used for extending credit and to regrowing the economy, essentially. They didn't do that. That's why we're in the state we're in right now, which
Was
is
it
unfortunately...
Bernanke who said
I'm sorry.
that he couldn't get a loan or something, or
I'm sorry.
mortgage?
For mortgage?
Yeah, either a mortgage or a loan that
Oh,
he
with,
applied and he was turned down.
Oh, I'd heard that recently as well, too. I don't know the details of that. Yeah, I'm not sure entirely, so I don't want to comment on that per se. But
basically what I'm trying to say is that credit is not that easy to get for people.
no,
if
it's
they
not.
want.
No, absolutely not. And that's really the heart of my point here, is that we could have made credit, we could have extended credit, especially where it concerns new businesses, because almost 2/3 of all new jobs are created from new businesses, not from corporations that presently exist. And thank them, of course, for their contribution to the hiring and the labor force that they do contribute to the economy. But the vast majority, 2/3 of new jobs, and that's what we're talking about, growing the economy. We're talking about new jobs, not jobs that already exist. And I'm certainly thankful for those. But what I'm looking to do is create as many new jobs, as high in quality as possible. But this kind of, I've sidetracked our discussion
Yeah,
here.
that's another good qualifier you mentioned now, because there are some jobs available, but they are not the high-end jobs. They're not the
That's
good
absolutely
jobs. They are very low-paying jobs.
Absolutely correct. If you look at the recent the labor and employment statistics that come out on a weekly basis, and if you look carefully at the number of jobs, new jobs that are created and added, what you're going to find is that many of those qualify as temporary jobs and less than full-time employment. So employers now are much more incentivized to employ employees for less than 40 hours a week. For in fact, 32 and a half hours is where many of them kind of target to employ new employees. So that's the kind of, unfortunately, job and job quality that we're getting at this time. We're getting the lower end type of jobs temporary jobs, the lower paying jobs, which you might classify
and which don't add to skills. They don't offer any training.
Absolutely
Most companies
correct.
don't offer
Absolutely correct.
anything.
Now, I wanted to step back a little bit to discuss a little bit about...
Because I was trying to bring it to the education from there. But
education. I'd be happy to talk about education as well, too. But I did want to finish up at the earlier discussion we had had about what the Green Party was and what it was all about, because it's often, as I said before, lambasted for being communist or socialist-oriented. There is certainly a certain amount of social consciousness associated with it. It's my opinion that it's a social consciousness that's associated from a democratic view of things.
And you have a website for the party?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, I do have a pamphlet that I sometimes hand out that talks about the 10 key values of the Green Party. Yeah. And I could talk about those in greater detail. But again, the Green Party itself, as being a party that is focused on democratic, grassroots policy making. It's policy making and politicking rather, that benefits communities, that benefits people in the communities, and not just the profit motive for a corporation per se, although that's important. What I started to say with public banking was it's allocation of capital for the highest and best use to those communities from which it came. Nothing gets more capitalistic than that, highest and best use. Create communities that are sustainable, create communities that grow businesses,
it's not
jobs,
anti-capitalistic.
Absolutely not. And if you characterize it as highest and best, what you're going to find out.
I believe that would be the camera.
So here what I'm showing is a pamphlet that I'll sometimes hand out that discusses the Green Party of Connecticut. And it talks about some of the important points, our 10 key values here, where we have, for example, the social justice, decentralization, nonviolence, democracy, of course, one of its cornerstones, the future future green environment, general equity. I don't know if you can
he's going to focus on it. I don't know if you can.
Let me see if I could straighten this out.
No,
Okay.
it's going off the screen. Yeah.
There we go. Here we go. And you'll notice that we have a website up there. It's the greenparty.org. CT Green Party, www.ctgreenparty.org. Feel free to click on that. It'll go into more detail the 10 key values of the Green Party. And some of those I mentioned here. Specifically, what I always like to talk about with respect to banking, I talk about democratic banking, banking for, of, and by the people. It doesn't get much more capitalistic or democratic than that, where you have the highest and best use of the money that came from a community going back into the community. That's what I'm talking about. So take a look at the website here, www.ctgreenparty.org. Let me go on to talk just a little bit about, you talked about education. As you know, I'm a proponent of education, being that I come from a very lengthy academic background, having spent many years, 13 odd years in colleges and universities, and even taught in some in universities myself. One of the things I've noticed about the present educational process that we have, and one of the things that I would hope that we can fix or correct or work towards is, number one, the big gap between the performance of the minority students and some of the majority students. So say the socially disenfranchised or socially challenged,
or newer
socioeconomically.
immigrants. Very often it's the newer immigrants.
Absolutely correct. Latinos and Latinas, or potentially Asian or potentially European, Eastern European. The gap between their performance.
Initially, they have the difference. Yeah.
There is a difference.
We only
but
have
even
less
upon
than 3 minutes.
Less than 3 minutes. I'll try to wrap up here quickly. So the point being, I would like to narrow that gap, that performance gap. And that's a measurable gap. That can be measured by things like achievement tests, things like ACT or SAT, Scholastic Aptitude Test at the exiting of high school, and tests along the way too. And the second thing I think we should work towards are a more varied type of certification or diplomas that they can earn. Maybe not just a high school diploma or a college diploma, perhaps technical sort of certifications or diplomas on the way. Not everyone wants to or is potentially even cut out to be a PhD in rocket science or something.
No.
But certainly everyone should have the benefit and the opportunity to go as far as they possibly can, to be able to achieve as much as they possibly can, whether it's an intermediate certification, an associate's degree,
so those
or an
should be
undergraduate
expanded
degree.
According to your
I think we should work very hard on making sure that that is a real possibility for all students in the future. I won't talk too much about Common Core other than to say I was very disappointed with, unfortunately, how it made, and I can speak with something of an authoritative view where it comes to math and science, given that I have a PhD in physics and I have master's degree in computational and quantitative finance. And I can tell you, I was very disappointed with the complexity that is shown for simple math. Simple addition, simple multiplication, simple subtraction, simple division. I have looked at their approach. They've overcomplicated the process. The number of steps you have to do now is literally double what you would have had to have done previously.
And more children are going to give up then.
Precisely. And if that was the agenda, then mission accomplished. But I can't think, and I hope to goodness that's not the agenda. I would say go back to the simple approach to math. The 3 R's I've always advocated for: reading, writing, and arithmetic, so-called. If you get those down at a mastery level, upon graduation from high school, you would be able to handle just about any college, freshman year college program that your Scholastic Aptitude Test and your achievements there would be able to enter you into.
Ed, we are out of time, unfortunately. I do hope you can come back again sometime to talk a little bit more. Thank you very much for explaining about the new party so people can now have another choice. And I love the principles and the points that you've discussed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Usha. It's been a pleasure.
That was Ed Heflin, and I hope you all enjoyed the show. Please write with your comments and questions to practicaltalktime@yahoo.com. Thank you.